this morning. It is great to be in this day, the Lord's Day. We're going to continue our study this morning, studying the life of Christ. But before we get started, let's start with the word of prayer. Brother Jim, would you lead us, please?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful Lord's Day that you have provided us with. We thank you, God, for your very presence here. We are thankful, God, that we have this opportunity to come together to study a portion of thy word. We pray to God that we might take this study and apply it to our very lives, that it might enable us to become better Christians and just a little brighter light in this community and around the world. We're so thankful this morning, God, for your Son, Jesus. For without him, our gathering here would be in vain. We're thankful that he sacrificed himself on the cross. He took upon that cross the sins of the world. And we are grateful, God, that through the washing of his blood, we can have the hope of eternal life. We ask you, God, to be with the sick and bereaved that are amongst our number, for there are many. You know their needs better than we do, God, and we just pray thee that you might be with the medical providers, that it would be thy will that they might be restored to their much wanted health. We ask you, God, to be with the church plant effort here, that through that effort more souls might be brought to you and into your kingdom. We ask you to be with Brother Troy this morning as he brings forth this lesson. Please give him a ready recollection of that which he has prepared, that it might be simple, that we might gather it into ourselves. This is our prayer, and we ask it in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Brother Jim. Once again, good morning to everyone. If you're just joining us for the first time, we're glad to have you with us. Or if you've been with us for the last couple of weeks, you'll know that we've been studying the life of Christ. And we've started the study of the life of Christ by backing up a little bit before starting that study in what we're calling the Intertestamental period. It's basically a period of history that we've been studying because it will help us understand more about Jesus, more about what we read in the gospel accounts, as well as help us understand why God sent his Son in that time, 2,000 years ago. Now, we have a worksheet that we've been using. Did everybody bring your worksheet from the weeks before? All right, good. We got a few of them. I have a few extras here. If you need one, if somebody could help me by passing those out, and be glad to give you those answers on those. So what we've done this last couple of weeks is we have studied the historical aspects of the intertestamental period. And in that intertestamental period, we started by starting with the verse Galatians 4:4 that says, God sent forth his Son in the fullness of time. And we've been focusing on that word, the fullness of time. What does that mean? And we backed up a little more into the prophecy of Daniel 2:44 that says, in the days of these kings, he will set up a kingdom that shall last forever. And so what does that mean? The days of these kings. And so we studied this in looking at the world powers that existed during that time. So if you've got your study sheet now, we'll run over this real quick of what we have studied to give this as a review before we continue on this morning with the cultural context of what we're working with. So, number 2, in the time of Christ would come was prophesied in Daniel 2:44. And history has revealed that in the time of these kings can be seen in the following progression that we can see in history. Letter A, the what empire lasted from 606 to 536? The Babylonian Empire. That was the first empire that was prophesied in the prophecy of Daniel. And then, after the Babylonians came the what empire? The Medo-Persian Empire. Then after that came the Greek Empire. And then by the time we get to Christ, when Christ arrives, we are in the what? Roman Empire. That's very important to understand because he says in the days of these kings, and in that prophecy, there are 4 different kingdoms that he is prophesying about. And it's important to understand that. Now, just to clarify a little more, we're going to skip down now to number 4. You go down to number 4, and I kind of went over this real fast last week, didn't give you an opportunity to fill this in, so I'm going to help you a little bit. When we're getting closer to Christ, as in that 400 years between Malachi, the last prophet, and Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, when we first hear of prophecy again, first hear of God speaking to people, there's 400 years. And so that letter A under number 4, it says, the blank ruled over Judea from 323 to 198. So when the Bible ends, the people are speaking Aramaic, the Medo-Persians are in power, and then when the Bible opens again in the gospel accounts, all of a sudden we have this Roman Empire. And so what has happened? There's several things that happened. And in that, we talked about who came after the Medo-Persian Empire, and that was the Greek Empire. But was it just the Greeks? Who was the conqueror, by the way, in the Greek Empire? Alexander the Great. Everybody knows that name. But the Greek Empire actually has different facets to it, and that's what this is right here. So the letter A, the Ptolemies. The Ptolemies ruled over Judea from 323 to 198. Who can tell me who the Ptolemies were? What does that mean? The Ptolemies. He was one of the generals. When Alexander the Great died, he had 4 generals who then divided the Greek Empire, if you will, into 4 different parts, and those 4 different generals began to rule those parts. Judea fell under one of those rulers, one of those generals. His name was Ptolemy, and so the Ptolemies ruled over Judea for that amount of time. But then, that wasn't good enough for one of the generals down south in Egypt, and so he moved up, came in from Syria, and that is the Seleucids. So the letter B is the Seleucids ruled over Judea from 198 to 110 BC. Well, was it just a time of peace and tranquility during that period whenever the Greeks were ruling Judea? Did they just sit back and just kind of relax a little bit, or what happened? Anybody remember? They got out of control, didn't they? And they rebelled. Anybody remember that part of the story? The Maccabees. The Maccabees rebelled against the rulers at the time, which was, anybody remember that guy's name? Antiochus Epiphanes. Very good. He was a terrible person who persecuted the Jews, the Hebrews, and so the Maccabees rebelled. And this brought in letter C, the Hasmonean dynasty. You can put Maccabee there if you want to, but the Hasmonean, because of the priest that was put in place with that name. And then, who can tell me who occupied Jerusalem in 63 BC? Pompey. General Pompey of the Romans came marching in and fought with the occupiers there, and then wound up occupying Jerusalem. Well, during the time of the Roman Empire, we also talked about this, the Romans put in place certain leaders. And one of those leaders was a famous person who killed the babies, and we read about that. Herod the Great. So this is the Herodian dynasty, letter E, began in 37 BC. All right, so that tells you we're starting to get closer to Jesus now. We're starting to see all the players are in place. And this is an important aspect to understand why God sent forth His Son in the fullness of time at that time. So, here's a little bit more of a trick question. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. Letter F. Who was the ruler of Galilee at the time of the crucifixion? We know who was the ruler of Judea whenever Jesus was born. That was Herod the Great. But now let's jump all the way to his crucifixion. Who was the ruler? Well, that's the Roman Empire. So in Judea, it says in Galilee. Who was the ruler of Galilee? Think about the story when they sent him up to see somebody. Well, Pilate, look down at letter G. Governor of Judea at the time of crucifixion was Pontius Pilate. That's letter G. Okay, so Pontius Pilate sent Jesus to who? It's close. Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas. Okay? Just to have that little bit of information right there. Okay, so that's our quick review. A lot of information real fast, but that's 2 weeks worth of information that we've studied. So today we're going to move forward and we're going to go into the cultural context. We've talked about world powers. Well, now we're going to talk about what the culture was like there in Judea by the time Christ comes. There's a lot of other players that come in, and I wish I had time to tell you all the wonderful stories. I've had several of you come up to me afterwards and tell me some of the stories. I'd never heard many of them, things that happened during these that were making reference to these different parts of history, but there's all kinds of other stories I wish we had time to tell, but we would be here for a very long time. So we're going to just go on through this, and one of the books I can tell you is a book that Brother Joe Wilson turned me on to. It's called The Fullness of Time by a Dr. Penny, and I can write that down for you. It's a wonderful book, explains a lot of detail. It's a fascinating read, and it'd be worth your while if you wanted to get that. So what were the cultural context of Judea by the time Christ comes in? We're dealing with a lot of facets, and one of the main things is that Judea is a center of religion. There's a lot of religious practice that takes place in this area, and so basically a land bridge between two world powers, and now it's become one world power with the Roman Empire. And so we have these philosophies and religions that are infiltrating or permeating into the culture. And one of the things that develops during the time of the Roman Empire is king and emperor worship. And that becomes more fierce and more serious as you move on into the latter part of the New Testament. And whenever people were killed, if they weren't bowing down to the emperor and worshiping him. And homes in Judea back in that time had little niches in them, like you see in this picture right here, where they had these little gods in there, and they worshiped multiple gods. The Romans believed in the mythological gods of Zeus and things like that. So there's lots of different gods involved. So the idea of God of heaven, which we know about in in Acts 17, is just one more, but Paul was explaining to them, you've got it all wrong. He is the God. And so that's where this begins to develop. And it develops because of philosophers. You've heard of Socrates, Socrates, as we call him sometimes. Socrates, he began teaching, men began thinking for themselves. And then along comes Plato, and he starts adding a more spiritual aspect to it. And then finally we have Aristotle, who introduces logic. These are all important things to help man begin to make the right decisions, because whenever they receive the gospel message, one must think for themselves, they must think spiritually, and they must think logically. And so those are important aspects that develop during this Greek period and now moving into the Roman period. Then there's also Epicureanism and Stoicism. I wish we had more time to talk about those, but they are also affecting the gospel message. Yes?
The Epicurean, if memory serves me, had the philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry.
Yes, basically.
They were kind of a partying group.
Yeah, and it distorts the gospel message. That's why it's important to understand what's taking place. But if we back up and look at what's most important, and that is God's people, we're looking at Judaism. Let's look at the different aspects of Judaism. And it begins with their writings. They had, of course, the Scriptures. We've talked about that a little bit, that they had the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. In the time it was the only Testament. They didn't call it the Old Testament. And so they had the Scriptures from Genesis all the way to Malachi that they were studying, that they were understanding. But they also had what they called the Talmud. Talmud is rabbinical writings. It's those oral traditions that you hear Jesus and the disciples talk about. In fact, the Talmud is made up of two different parts. One of them is called the Mishnah, and the other is called the Gemara. The Mishnah means to repeat, and what that is, they are rabbinical teachings, and that's where this oral tradition comes in. In fact, it became at a point that they thought that they put more emphasis on the oral teaching. They would look at what some rabbi had interpreted. Let's say he interpreted some scripture, and the way he interpreted that became more important than the scripture itself. And that's why Jesus says, you're taking traditions of men and putting them above the Word of God. And then the Gemara means to master by study, and that contains this Jewish law and also a mix of folklore, things like that. And then they had the Septuagint. The Septuagint is just a translation of the Hebrew Bible. It's translated from Hebrew into Greek. And there are different versions of the Septuagint, but also it's not mentioned here is we have the Apocryphal writings, which are not inspired, but were beginning to be used in different areas. And it became about because of these rabbinical oral traditions and things like that. So Judaism, in the time of Jesus, to some extent, was a result of changes that were a consequence of pressures of the intertestamental period. So many things that were happening had an effect on Judaism. That's why it was so different whenever Jesus got here. Now, another key element that took place during this 400 years is called the dispersion, or the diaspora. The dispersion began during the captivity, whenever they carried off Israel into the captivity in Assyria, and then later Judah into Babylon. Well, what happens is you have the Jewish people are taken out of their homeland and transplanted into other areas. Well, after 70 years, what happens in the Babylonian captivity? What happens? They were released. Cyrus allowed them to go back to Judea if they wanted to, but guess what? A lot of Jewish people did not go back. A lot of the Hebrews, they lived there for 70 years. I'm not going to take up roots and go somewhere else. And so they wound up spreading out all over. And by the time we get to the Roman Empire, they are in all the chief cities of the Roman Empire. They're in Babylon, Assyria, Syria, Phoenicia, Asia Minor, Greece, Egypt, North Africa, and Rome. In fact, it's estimated that in the time of Christ, there were over 1 million Jews, Hebrews, that were throughout the entire Roman Empire. And so, the Jewish faith outside of Palestine, you don't have the temple. It was destroyed whenever Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. They no longer have a place to do their animal sacrifices. They no longer have a place to worship God. So they developed synagogues. And then we're going to talk about synagogues in just one second. And these synagogues were the place where they could go and worship. There were no animal sacrifices. But this set the stage, if you will, for the missionaries of the early church to begin their ministries to the Gentiles among the dispersion in those synagogues using the Greek translation of the Old Testament. You're going to start seeing all the pieces of the puzzle come together as God then sends forth His Son in the fullness of time. And so these synagogues, you've heard of that, the synagogues, we read about that in the New Testament. Well, what are they, where do they come from, and why? Well, when they were in exile, as we just mentioned, with the removal of the temple, it was destroyed. You think about how you would feel, okay, if some army were to come in here and conquer Milton, Florida, and just uproot us and ship us off to some other place. You are no longer an American. You are no longer a practicing Christian. You lose all your identity. We don't have this church building. We don't have any of those things. And this is even more important to the Jews because they had the temple, which represents God on earth, and that's been destroyed. Their writings, imagine how you would feel. And so what began to happen is the people began to congregate together, and even though her faith was almost extinct, began to really focus on the scriptures that they did have. Yes?
Wasn't the temple rebuilt by Zerubbabel?
It was, but we're talking about in the time when they were carried off into captivity. So for 70 years we had no temple, correct?
Well, you got in the time of Jesus, so that's what I was saying.
Is that what messed it? Okay. The temple destroyed is here, and that's just...
Religions and philosophies of Palestine in the time of Jesus.
Okay. Okay. Well, by the time you get to the time of Jesus, we're backing up, remember, before we get to Jesus. Thank you for pointing that out. Okay. So during the captivity, there's no temple, and they start to congregate and focus more on trying to save their heritage. Even the Hebrew language, they're speaking Hebrew, reading the Bible, the Old Testament, and then just trying to develop their identity as a Jewish nation. And so the synagogue was born. And this basically means, the word synagogue means assembly. And it's where they would read the Torah and the Talmud. Remember what we were talking about with the writings that they have. What's the Torah? What is the Torah? Say again, brother. The first 5 books of the Old Testament, of the Bible. So they would read that, and then they developed the Talmud, which we just talked about. And so they're reading, if you will, the Old Testament. By AD 70, they calculate that there were somewhere between 400 to 1,000 synagogues throughout the entire Roman Empire. They were presided over by a leader and a council of elders. That's why we read sometimes. You remember that story of the ruler of the synagogue that came to Jesus and asked him to heal his child? That's what we're talking about here. They had a ruler that was over it and a council of elders. But because it's not the temple, you cannot have animal sacrifices in those places. It was just a place to meet and read and pray and worship God. So when they returned from exile, now we're getting closer to the time of Jesus. Yes, the temple was rebuilt, and even though the temple was there in Jerusalem, there still continued to be synagogues all around that area, including Jerusalem. And so it was a time whenever the Jewish people began to try to reestablish their identity, preserve their language, preserve their religion, and maintain that lineage, which really makes sense when you think about what God prophesied over and over through the prophets, that a what would return to Jerusalem? A remnant. Remember that? He always talks about a remnant. So we're talking about a small amount of people compared to what the nation of Israel was before it went into captivity. Now, what does this do? This sets the stage for more things. For example, the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin it means sitting together, and it's a council. If you will, turn with me to Matthew 26, 57. Matthew 26, verse 57. We're going to see here, I'm going to show you this word. If somebody could read 57 through 59. 26, 57 through 59.
Then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered, and Peter was following him at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and going inside he sat with the guard to see the end.
Okay? And so in verse 59, we have, it says, now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council. This is the New King James Version. Does anybody have a different word there?
Elders.
The elders. Any other different word? Okay. That word council in the Greek language is the word Sanhedrin. Okay, and I'm doing an English version of that pronunciation. Yes, sir. Yes. How about that? That's very interesting. So that word Sanhedrin is a biblical word. It's a word that describes this council that took place. And this came about around the 3rd century. So we're talking 300 years before Christ. It operated only in Jerusalem. And it was composed of 70 members. Where does that come from? Does anybody remember? Why would you pick 70? Well, that's one reason, maybe. But if you think back to the days of in the desert, and you remember Moses' father-in-law, and he came and said that it was too much to judge all these people. What's that, brother? Yeah, I love it. Say again?
He appointed
70 judges. Because Moses couldn't handle the work of millions of people, and so he appointed 70 judges. So that's where this comes from. There you go. And so this idea of 70, all right, it was made up of Sadducees, priests, nobles, some Pharisees, scribes and elders, all under the high priest. And its power was limited because, remember, the Jewish nation is under the Roman Empire. That's why they took Jesus to Pilate, and they even say in Luke, said, we can't put him to death. We don't have the power to put him to death. They could only cite things, they could only enforce things under the law of their religion. But when it came to capital punishment and things like that, they had to go through the Roman leaders. Those important points to understand. And what did Pilate say whenever they brought him to him? He says, I find no fault in the man. Go and judge him according to your law. Ended with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. All right, moving on. Matthew 23. Let's go to Matthew 23. This is the I, or woe, we say. I is in Spanish. Woe to you, he says. Woe to you what? Verse 2. Or I can jump down here. I've got verse 13. Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and then what does he call them? Hypocrites. Woo! And this whole thing is full of them. Woe to you, woe to you, woe to you. So who are these Pharisees? Where did they come from? Whenever Malachi closes, as we mentioned, they were under Persian rule, and they were back in rebuilding the temple and stuff. They were having some problems, but there were nothing like Pharisees. So where did this come from? Well, they appeared, again, about 300 B.C., very influential leadership. The Jews became Hellenized. What does Hellenized mean? Can anybody tell me that? The Greek culture. To be Hellenized or Hellenization means this Greek culture. So whenever Alexander Campbell conquered a nation, he then says, you're going to be Greek. And he started teaching that culture, and you started speaking. Say again? What did I say? Alexander Campbell. Well, Alexander Campbell said we need to speak Greek too. Do you know, speaking, I'm going to take a little side note on that. Do you know Alexander Campbell, he had a Greek translation that he knew Greek, and he translated the Bible, and he took every single word that says baptized, and he put in immersed. And not only that, he could cite, if I have my facts correct, and you can correct me if I don't, he could cite an entire, I believe it was Matthew, in Greek. That man was brilliant. So, not Alexander Campbell, Alexander the Great, whenever he conquered a nation. That's right. Make sure you keep you on your toes, and you are on your toes. When he conquered a nation, then he Hellenized. That means to influence one with the Greek culture. Well, the Hebrew people did not like that. They're trying to preserve their language. They're trying to preserve their nationality. They're trying to preserve their religion. They resented it. And so you have this long story, I wish we had time, of this priest that says, I'm not going to do that. And through his followers, developed this group called the Separatists. And their purpose was to preserve the national integrity, the language and culture, the temple ceremonialism, and strict compliance with the law of Moses. Now, what's interesting about them is that they started out as a reaction to a perceived need. They see these people coming in trying to change our culture, trying to change our identity, and so they reacted. But then once that diminished under the Roman Empire, they didn't stop. They kept going. And in fact, they went on to enumerate the laws. You see there, in contrast to the 2 commands that Christ gave, the Pharisees developed a system of 613 laws that they counted in the Bible. 365 negative, 248 positive commands. Well, they go further than that, going back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, with that writing called the Talmud, had over 1,100 laws, oral tradition laws, that they expected the people to obey. Now, 1,100 plus 600, wow. How do we keep up with all that? And that's why Jesus criticizes them here, saying that you are hypocrites, because you are so concerned about what? Things like tithing, mint, and cumin, instead of taking care of your parents, honoring your parents. And they would, what was that, wash the inside of cups and things like that instead of worrying about the more weightier matters. And so they focused too much. What started out as a perceived need became so focused and so inwardly focused that it developed into hypocrisy. So by the time Christ comes, they were basically a heartless, cold, and arrogant brand of righteousness. Now also you could look right here or go to Matthew 3. I know it says Mateo because I translated this out of Spanish because I wrote it in Spanish. Mateo 3, Matthew 3. The Sadducees appeared about the same time. as the Pharisees. But unlike the Pharisees, they were in favor of adopting the Greek culture. So when Alexander the Great came in, they agreed with him or were okay with it. They also controlled the Sanhedrin. Now, they were very aristocratic. They were a very priestly, materialistically priest group, and quite frankly, rather irreligious. They were not very religious at all. Not numerous, but very rich and influential, and they collaborated with the Roman Empire. That's why they were so upset. That's why Jesus says, you like the high seats. You like to be called rabbi in the courtyards. That's why you like all this stuff, because you want to have control, and you know that the big power in control is Rome, and that's why you collaborate. So I'm adding some words there that are not in the Bible, but that's the idea of what Jesus was battling whenever it came time to deal with the Sadducees. Now, they did not believe in angels or the resurrection. They denied punishment and resurrection and glory of the future life. They rejected the Pharisee laws. And so that's why what we have sometimes is Paul, who was what? What was Paul? He was a Pharisee. And so Paul, recognizing this, would go whenever he was being judged in the Sanhedrin, he's looking around going, okay, I see some FSU guys over here, some Florida guys over here. Guess what? You FSU guys, go Gators! And what happens? Oh man, the fight ensues. And that's what he does. He incites the Sadducees against the Pharisees because they have doctrinal differences to the point that they're willing to fight each other. Now it's interesting that they come together and work together with one common enemy. Who was that enemy? Jesus Christ. So it's very sad. Now another thing he mentions, and you can go to Luke 11, 52 to 54, where you can see he talks about, he also mentions these scribes. Now, what is a scribe? A scribe is a copyist. It's basically one who sits down and copies the law. Didn't have copy machines back then. Didn't have means of if I wanted, a lot of times I hear preachers, and I love this saying, if you have your copy of the Lord's Word, please open it too. Okay, well, if you wanted a copy back then, you had to have it handwritten. Remember the Ethiopian eunuch? He was riding back to Ethiopia, and what was he doing? He was reading a copy of Isaiah. Let me tell you, that was expensive. Expensive. So these guys, that's what they did. They would sit in a room, and in fact, tradition developed in Masoretes where they'd sit in a room, and they would dictate the Bible, and these guys would be writing it out or looking at it and writing it out, and they were so strict that they would count the letters, they would count the words, and if it was off by just even one, they would throw the whole thing out and start over. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found a bunch of these. It's basically trash, but there's a couple of errors that were made, so they had to start completely over. So they're copyists, and because they're sitting there copying all the time, then therefore they knew the Bible quite well. They studied it, they interpreted it, and they transmitted them to the people. And they believed in a literal translation of the Scriptures. And so that's why they're called doctors, teachers, or interpreters of the law. And they were recognized authorities because they knew the Bible, because that's all they did all day was copy the Bible. They had great influence among the people, and they taught in the temple and the synagogues, and that's why you will see Jesus confronting them. And they believed in the resurrection and of angels and the coming Messiah. So they had their heads on pretty much right, but they liked their power just a little bit too much. And that's why he would call them hypocrites. Now, let's turn to Mark 3. Mark 3, verse 6. And we see another group of people that's quite interesting. Mark 3, verse 6. Somebody will read that, please.
Then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him.
Okay, now we have another group in here. We have these Pharisees that have appeared in this 400 years of silence, and then we have the Sadducees over here. We have these scribes, which, by the way, scribes have been around even before this 400 years because they always needed to copy the Scriptures. So the scribes is a group that has been around for a very long time. But the Herodians, the name should be the clue of where they came from. They basically were a political party that favored the what? Herod, yes. Herod the Great, that's right. and his children. So we know through history, and we're going to study this as we get more into the Scriptures and studying the life of Christ, these different Herods that we read about in the Bible, they're all Herod the Great's children and his lineage. Now, they believed in that cooperating with the Romans protected the interests of the country. So they thought we need to make sure everything is good, status quo, so that we can continue as things are going, prospering. And so the people hated them. And the Herodians joined the Pharisees in order to destroy Jesus. Then you have a group called the Zealots. And if you look in Luke 6, verse 15, and you hear Simon the Zealot, well, who are they? Who are these guys? This is yet another group that was founded by Judas of Galilee, which you can read about in Acts 5, verse 37. It was an intensely nationalist political party against the Romans, and they frequently sided or tried to stir up rebellions and skirmishes. They were considered troublemakers. So they objected to Israel paying tribute to a pagan emperor, thought it was a betrayal of God and a true king of Israel. They were fanatics of freedom and were awaiting the Messiah. But they looked at the Messiah as a military leader. They were waiting to be liberated and put back into the time of David. Yes, sir. Oh, yes. He said they must have really hated the Herodians. Yes. They were completely, anybody who was for the Roman occupation was an enemy. The Zealots were strict, purist, nationalist patriots to the Hebrew nation. And what they wanted and believed was that the Messiah meant this military ruler that was going to come in and reestablish everything the way it was back in the days of David. In fact, it is believed that the Zealots are the reason why Jerusalem was destroyed in AD 70. They kept making so many problems that finally the Romans said, enough is enough, and they went in and destroyed Jerusalem. And then finally we have the publican and the tax collector. These are Jews who, for the love of money, they collaborated with Rome, and they collected the taxes that Rome commanded. And the way it worked is they would tell Rome, I can get this much money out of my constituents, out of the area, I say constituents, out of the citizens that live in my region. Well, then he might hire somebody to go actually get the money. And whatever it was, let's say it was $1. It was $1 for each person. Rome requires $1 from every one of you. Well, then the chief publican would charge you $2. Well, then his buddies that he would send out who worked under him might charge you $3. So $1 goes to the buddy, $1 goes to the publican, and then finally $1 makes it to Rome. So you can imagine they were not very well liked. Now it's interesting here that the Sadducees and the Pharisees, mainly the Pharisees, remember they cited Jesus as a sinner. He says, he eats with sinners and publicans. Remember that verse? Well, the reason being is because a sinner to a Pharisee is anybody outside of an obedient Jew. So if you're a Gentile, or if they considered them not obedient Jews because they were collaborating with Rome, they were considered sinners. So a sinner is not necessarily somebody who is committing sin as God says it. To them, a sinner was anybody outside of Judaism. Now, most of them were very rich, and people regarded them as apostate Jews. Okay, this is what I want to get to. We're going to close with this. We've got just about 5 minutes left. And so on your worksheet, this is what we've been working towards this entire time. And we're going to go over this brief review, and then I'm going to fill in the blank in number 3. So let's do a quick review again of what we studied the last now 3 weeks. Galatians 4:4. God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in the fullness of time. Why did God send forth His Son at this time? Well, looking at this intertestamental period, 400 years before, or I should say between the Testaments, what do we have? A brief review. What is the first thing that we talk about with that prophecy of Daniel 2:44? There's going to be 4 kingdoms. Once again, what is that fourth kingdom, or that first kingdom we talk about? Babylon. Who was the principal leader in Babylon? Nebuchadnezzar. So we have the Babylonian Empire and Nebuchadnezzar. And then who comes after that? Medo-Persians. Who is the principal leader of that? Cyrus the Great. So there we have Cyrus, who released the Jews to go back to Judea. After that we have what? Greek Empire. Who were some of the main people in that? Not Alexander Campbell. Alexander the Great. And the 4 generals. Okay. Also we have Epiphanes. We have the Maccabean independence. It was also this Greek influence that begins to have a big effect on Palestine at the time, as well as the development of synagogues. And then finally we have the what? Roman Empire. General Pompey, Herod the Great. This is important to understand because looking at that prophecy of Daniel, how many did he name off? Here's your hint. He named 4. So you can't calculate anything else. Some people make the mistake of calling the Maccabean independence one of those empires. It was not a world power. Their world powers were Babylon, Persians, Greeks, and Romans. There were no other world powers that dominated Palestine. So we see that translation, that prophecy revealed and, what's the word I'm looking for? Fulfilled. Exactly the way he said it was going to happen. That's important to understand. This is where he said he's going to establish a kingdom. Now, in the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. So, what do we have? Here's your answers to number 3. We have a large, singular world power, and that is Rome. Why is that important? Why is it important to have one large world power? Good. You know, that's the big thing, Roman citizenship. And so through that, you could travel throughout this entire area. You have a time of peace that, you want to consider it peace, but there's no other nations that are vying over Palestine at the time. And so you have this control, if you will, and it's a time that is completely different than any other time in history. The second thing that happens, you have a universal language of the world, and that language is Greek. It came about because of Alexander the Great coming in with that influence, and it lasted even through the Roman Empire. And so you have the entire known world speaking one language. Is that beneficial? Absolutely. Trust me, being a missionary going down to South America, having to learn a language, wow. It's still difficult. And so being able to trust, and let me say this, finally getting to teach and preach in English is marvelous. I love it because I can actually say what I want to say. The freedom of religion. This is the other thing that comes in under the Roman rule. The Romans had many gods, and so to them, this is just one more god that they added to their arsenal, if you will. And so they allowed the Jews to practice their religion if they wanted to. They had, as Joey mentioned, an extensive highway system. Before that, we didn't have anything like this. So for the first time in history, you can travel, as Joey mentioned, all the way from Italy over to Palestine down to Egypt unencumbered. And so then that helps in the sending forth of his Son because it will help in the sending out of the gospel. Number 5, man was thinking for himself, thinking spiritually, thinking logically. Again, that Greek influence of those philosophers. You have the scattering or the dispersion of the Jews was now complete. And what does that mean? Ready for the day of Pentecost. Do you remember in Acts chapter 2, all the different nations that were listed in there? Those were all Jewish people. Why do we have all these nations and why are they in Jerusalem? I'm going to test your Old Testament history here. Why? They had to return. Jewish males had to go back to Jerusalem 3 times a year. And one of those was the day of Pentecost. And so you have all of them coming in. And what does that do for the gospel? What are they going to do? They're going to go back to where they came from, and the gospel is going to spread like wildfire. That's what Jesus means by a mustard seed. It will grow into a tree. All those kingdom parables. What's that? Well, it's going to come into, when you get into Acts, They stayed in Jerusalem. They stayed in Jerusalem until persecution came along, and then they finally went out and started preaching. Another diaspora. Number 7, synagogues were built in all the key cities. They're just waiting to come alive with the teachings of Jesus. What a great and wonderful aid for spreading the gospel. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could go to, and we can, but we could go to any city and we already have something there that we could just walk right in and start teaching the Bible and converting people. Well, they had that in these synagogues because Paul was a Jew, he was a Pharisee. He could walk in and say, brethren, I'm part of this. I'm part of this culture. But let me tell you something that I've learned. And then he could show in the Scriptures how the Messiah had come. The Old Testament was available in Greek through the Septuagint. And so all people could read the Bible, not just the Hebrew people. They preferred it in Hebrew, in Aramaic. But now even the Gentiles could read. What was the Ethiopian? Do you know what you're reading, said Philip? Let me explain it to you. Well, he was reading a Greek version, I would assume. We don't know that for a fact, but if he is not Jewish, and then here he is reading this. Actually, I think he was Jewish. I mean, he might have been a proselyte. Herod was in his palace, which would fulfill his part of the murder, deceit, and jealousy, and that is prophesied even in Jeremiah 31. So from this point, once again, looking at Galatians 4:4, do you see now why God sent forth His Son at this particular time? Every single thing was in place. All the pieces of the puzzle were in place that God had put in place in order to send forth His Son for the gospel message to go out, and it was the best time of any time in history. Questions or comments or concerns? Yes, sir. Syria. Mm-hmm.
And then between 135 and 140 is when Palestine actually came into existence.
Great point. No, that's a great point.
Whenever I'm reading stuff and they want to, like I've read, they call Jesus was a young Palestinian. No, he wasn't. Palestine, not only does Palestine not exist, but that's also a question today, or a political charge or something.
That's a good point. The names that are associated with all of that, we need to be very careful with, and we use those generally. That's a great point. Paul is saying that it wasn't even called Palestine, it was Judea. But now we know why these names came about, because of these world powers that were involved. Thank you, Paul. Very good point. Another comment? All right, well, next week then we're going to start and through the Scriptures, going through the Scriptures of the 4 gospel accounts to start in a chronological order of looking at the life of Christ. And we now have all this background information that we can understand where all these people came from. So whenever the Bible opens up in the New Testament, we now know who these people are, why we are where we are, and how it will affect the story of Christ. And so I look forward to having you here next Sunday as we open up the Scriptures and begin looking at the life of Christ. Thank you so much for your attention. We're now going to prepare for our time of worship.